There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when he becomes essential to a town, and then, by one act of conscience, becomes invisible to it. Most people never experience this paradox. Most people go their whole lives without ever understanding what it costs to be needed, and then to stop being tolerated. The weight of being the only skilled hand in 100 miles is a weight most men never question until the day they are forced to choose between the thing that makes them indispensable and the thing that makes them human. On that day, everything changes. The forge still burns, but no one comes. This is the story of Ezra Holloway, a blacksmith, and the drought year that tested not just his body, but the very foundation of the person he believed himself to be. The town of Stillwater, Montana Territory, in the year 1886, was the kind of frontier settlement that existed only because a blacksmith had decided to stay. Ezra Holloway had come west in 1879, a man in his early 20s with no family, no fortune, and the singular skill of working iron into shapes that mattered. He built the forge himself, a stone structure with a heavy wooden roof and wide doors that faced east so the dawn light would find his work. The anvil was imported from Philadelphia, and he had hauled it himself from Fort Benton, 14 days on horseback, with the iron balanced across 2 mules that hated him and every step they took. By the time he reached Stillwater, then nothing but 12 homesteads and a livery, Ezra had decided to stay. Within 5 years, he was the single thing holding the settlement together. Every bucket carried water. Every nail hung a door. Every plow that broke in the rocky soil came to his forge for repair. Cattle brands were his design. Horseshoes wore his mark. By 1886, when he was 34 years old and had not smiled at a woman in so long he could not remember the shape of the gesture, Ezra Holloway was the most essential, most isolated man in 3 territories. The summer of that year came dry. The sky held its breath from May through July, and the earth responded by cracking open like the hide of a starved animal. Wells that had never failed suddenly went hard and deep, and families found themselves watering horses with buckets instead of letting them drink from troughs. The cottonwood leaves curled brown at the edges a full month early. Dust rose from every footstep and settled on everything, a fine powder that worked into cloth and skin and teeth. The heat came on merciless and without mercy, the kind of heat that made stone roads shimmer and metal too hot to touch in the direct sun. Ezra worked in the cool darkness of his forge, grateful for the stone walls and the thick shadows, but even there the temperature rose. His leather apron grew dark with sweat. He drank water constantly, and it seemed never to stay in him. Cattle died despite the herds being kept as still as possible. Ranchers came to Ezra with faces burned red, asking if he could fashion deeper wells, wider troughs, anything to hold water longer. He worked from before dawn to after sunset, and even then there were men waiting in the yard with broken tools and urgent need written plain in their faces. It was in the last week of August, when the drought had tightened its grip until the entire territory seemed to be holding its breath, that the old man came. He appeared at the edge of town as the heat was beginning to break. Just barely, just the slightest ease as the sun moved lower in the sky. A figure on foot, moving slowly, and the town's few people who saw him first thought at first it was someone very old, and then someone very wrong, and then no one thought anything at all because they simply stopped looking. This was the way of frontier towns, with strangers of the kind that unsettled them. Ezra was working metal when someone brought him word, not asked, just told him like it was a fact he would need to know. An Indian, an old one, down by the well on Mainstone Street, collapsed or about to collapse. Maybe Ute, maybe Paiute, maybe Apache. No one knew, no one wanted to know. The water was precious, and he was taking up space near it. Ezra set down his work without finishing the thought. The tongs he was holding, he left on the bench. The metal would cool. Everything was in the habit of cooling these days. He walked out into the last of the sunlight and across the dusty expanse that served as the town's main street toward a cluster of people who were doing what townspeople do when confronted with something that frightens them and requires a decision. Nothing. The old man was sitting with his back against the stone coping of the well, and his left arm hung at an angle that no arm should hang at. It was broken badly, the bone having been forced through the skin once and then reset badly, leaving the limb swollen and discolored, green-black along the forearm and the wrist. His face was the color of old saddle leather, mapped with wrinkles so deep they seemed to go down to the bone. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin leggings and a loosely woven shirt, both dust-covered and torn. His hair was long and streaked with silver, pulled back with a leather cord. Around his neck hung a turquoise pendant on a rawhide string, and on his wrists were bands of silver that must have weighed 10 pounds together. In his other hand, the good one, he held a carved wooden staff, dark with age, the top wrapped with feathers. He was a medicine man. Anyone with eyes could see that. He was also dying of thirst. Ezra moved to him without thinking about moving, the way a man moves toward a fire that has come loose. He knelt. The dust rose around him like a small cloud, and he looked into the old man's eyes. There was clarity there, even in the drought pain, even in the sickness of infection that Ezra could see in the sweat on his face. The elder looked back at him without asking for anything. After a moment, Ezra reached out and took the staff and set it aside, then slowly, carefully, got the old man to his feet. Behind them, the townspeople said nothing. One woman turned away. The mayor's wife pulled her child's hand. Alderman Goss, who owned the largest ranch and therefore had the most at stake in this town's prosperity, stepped forward and opened his mouth to speak. But Ezra was already moving, already half carrying the old Apache man toward his forge, and something in the way he moved, not quickly, not violently, but absolutely certain, made Goss close his mouth and lower his hand. The forge was the coolest place in town when the sun was this low, and Ezra set the old man on a bench against the back wall, away from the heat of the banked fire, in the shadows where it was almost comfortable. He brought water, first a cup, which the elder drank without stopping, and then another, and then he let the old man drink as much as his body would take. The infection in the arm would need tending. Ezra had set bones before. Every blacksmith knows the anatomy of healing. He had splints, pieces of leather and wood he kept for exactly these purposes. Slowly, talking in a low voice about nothing in particular, about the heat and the drought and the way the stone of the forge stayed cool, Ezra began to set the arm properly. The old man did not cry out. He did not move. He only watched Ezra's face while Ezra worked, and when it was done, and the arm was strapped and splinted, he nodded once. Ezra brought him food, bread and salted meat, and fresh water, and then he built up the fire again, because the evening was coming and the temperature would drop, and he would need warmth. The elder lay on a cot in the back of the forge, the one Ezra used when work kept him late, and watched the flames, and was still. By morning, the town of Stillwater had made its decision about what this meant. The first sign was the silence. No one came to the forge with broken tools. No one appeared with horseshoes that needed repair. The families that had been waiting with buckets and with complaints simply stopped coming. It was a silence that was louder than any speech could be. A silence that said, "If this is your choice, then you have chosen not to be one of us." Alderman Goss came himself that second morning, not with anger, but with something worse. With regret, as if he was doing something he hated to do. He was a big man, heavy in the shoulders from years of work, and he came into the forge with the light behind him so his face was in shadow. "Holloway," he said, not Ezra, not even hello. Just the last name, the way a man calls a horse. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. Ezra was at the anvil, working a piece of metal more from habit than necessity. He did not look up. Alderman. "That's an Apache," Goss said. The word sounded like an accusation. "That's not shelter, Holloway. That's sedition. That's putting every settler in this territory in danger." "He's an old man with a broken arm," Ezra said. The hammer fell. The metal rang. "He's dying of thirst. He's medicine man. He's not a soldier. He's not a raider. He's a person who needed help, and I helped him." "You helped him. You endangered us. Those people have been conducting raids across New Mexico and Wyoming. They've been burning homesteads. They've been taking women and children. This is—" Goss stopped himself, started again. "You need to put him out, Holloway. You need to do that today, and you need to do it before this becomes something we can't take back." Ezra turned to look at him then, and the light of the forge caught his eyes. There was no anger there. Anger might have made it easier. What was there was something colder. "He stays," Ezra said. Goss left. But he did not leave the problem behind him. By the third day, families had begun shopping elsewhere. 3 days' ride to the next settlement with a blacksmith, but better that than being associated with a man who harbored Apaches. The ranches that had promised work in the spring sent word they would take their business to the new man. The stable owner, who had brought Ezra a steady supply of broken horseshoes from every animal that passed through, announced he would pay the new blacksmith to handle repairs. Even simple things, a broken hinge on a gate, a rusted nail that needed replacing, these were taken to the other shop. Within a week, the flow of work had slowed to almost nothing. The forge that had roared from dawn to dusk went quiet in great, echoing stretches. Ezra found himself inventing work just to keep the fire alive, just to have something to do besides sit with his thoughts. By the 5th day, Goss had hired a blacksmith from Missoula with the promise of housing and a percentage of every job he took in Stillwater. The man arrived on a Friday, a younger man, maybe 25, with quick hands and enough skill to handle simple work. He set up in a shed near Goss's ranch. By the end of the first week, he had taken the horseshoeing and simple repairs. By the 3rd week, he had begun to attract even the larger projects, undercutting Ezra's prices because he had nothing yet to lose and everything to gain. Ezra's forge went quiet. Not completely. There were still a few people, families with small children who had no allegiance to Goss, traveling workers passing through town, people who understood that work was work and principle was principle, and the two did not have to mix. But the daily rhythm broke entirely. The constant stream of townspeople, the endless parade of broken things that needed fixing, the importance of being the only one who could, all of it dried up. In losing his customers, Ezra lost his way into every aspect of the town's life. The stable owner, the ranchers, the families with children, the traveling merchants, they all began to rout around him as if he were an obstacle, a shape to avoid. He became something the town could, by a simple act of will, forget to see. Walking down the main street became an exercise in invisibility. People did not acknowledge him. Women pulled their children closer. Men looked toward the ground. The man who had once been essential was now simply absent, a ghost in his own town. The old man healed slowly. The broken arm knitted itself back together under the splint, and Ezra changed the bandages carefully, using cloths boiled clean and water that he had to haul from the deepest part of his own well. The infection burned itself out in a fever that lasted 2 days and 2 nights, during which Ezra sat by him and kept cold cloths on his head and whispered things in a voice that no one else heard. On the 3rd morning of the fever's break, the elder opened his eyes and looked at Ezra with clarity again, and something passed between them, some understanding that had no language. The old man asked for water in Spanish. Ezra gave it to him. After that, the healer began to move around the forge, learning its layout, moving carefully, watching everything. By the end of the 2nd week, the economic pressure had mounted into something that looked like a plan. A notice was posted on the wooden storefront in the center of town. A meeting was called for the evening of the 1st of September. The question to be decided was the future of the town, and specifically whether people of certain origins could remain in Stillwater if they posed a risk to the settlers. The language was careful. The meaning was not. Ezra stood in his forge on the afternoon of that day, and for the first time since the old man had come to his door, he found himself asking a question he had not allowed himself to ask before. What was he protecting? What was the cost? His income was cut to half of what it had been. The small savings he had accumulated over 7 years was being consumed at a rate that would leave him destitute within 6 months. No woman in the territory would marry a man who took Apache's side. No family would trust him with their horses. No rancher would bring his cattle brands to a blacksmith who harbored the enemy. The loneliness was not hypothetical. It was already here. It was in the way the sheriff, who had once drunk coffee with him at the general store, now looked at something just past his shoulder when they passed. It was in the way the owner of the boarding house, where Ezra took most of his meals, had suggested he might prefer to eat at home. It was in the price of everything. Flour cost half again as much when he bought it, as if his money was worth less. And the old man, he was healing, yes, but to what end? To send him out into the territory to be hunted? To keep him in the forge? An eternal prisoner? What did mercy look like when it was infinite? On the night before the meeting, Ezra sat alone in the back room of the forge, and the old man was sleeping on the cot, his breathing even and deep, his body finally at rest for the first time since he had arrived. Ezra thought about walking away. It was possible. He could take the old man out into the high country himself, leave him where the tribe could find him, and then return to town with a story. He had been forced out. The man had taken the horse and supplies and left in the night. No one would blame him. Everyone would understand. The weight would lift. He would be forgiven. But something in Ezra, something he could not name and did not want to understand, refused this path. It was not bravery. It was not even principle, not exactly. It was something closer to character, which is to say it was something he could not choose not to be without ceasing to be himself. A man does not save his own life by becoming a person he cannot live with. And Ezra Holloway was a man who knew that trade-off too well. His father had become that kind of person, had traded everything real for everything safe, and had died a small death long before his body gave up. Ezra had come west to be different, to be the kind of man who did what was right even when it cost something. And now the cost was coming due, and he had the choice to pay it, or to prove that everything he had believed about himself was a lie. The meeting that evening drew everyone, 70 or 80 people in the schoolhouse, which was also the church and the town hall, a single large room where democracy and God and education all happened to take place simultaneously. Goss stood at the front and spoke in measured tones about the necessity of taking a stand for civilization, for safety, for the future of their families. The sheriff, a weak man named Hadley, who had been chosen because he was popular rather than capable, spoke about the law, which technically protected no one because there was no law that mattered out here. The only law was what the town decided it was. A woman whose sister had been killed in a raid 3 years prior stood and spoke about the safety of her community and about how compassion sometimes looked like cowardice. When the vote came, it was nearly unanimous. Ezra should be given 48 hours to put the Apache man out of the territory, or the town would take action. What action was not specified, but the word had a weight that everyone understood. The old man was waiting in the forge when Ezra returned. He had built up the fire, something he should not have been able to do with a healing arm, and yet there it was. The flames were steady, and the heat was even. He looked at Ezra with the same clarity he had shown since the fever broke. Ezra told him what had happened, what was coming, what the town had decided. He told him in simple words, as if speaking to someone who did not share his language. And perhaps the old man did not the language of words, but he seemed to understand the meaning. When Ezra finished, the elder nodded and said something in Apache, a single word repeated twice, and then he pointed toward the back of the forge, toward the wooden door that opened onto the property behind, 10 acres of rocky land that Ezra had never found a use for. He pointed and waited. That night, Ezra could not sleep. He lay in the darkness of his small house, attached to the forge, and he listened to the wind and asked himself whether being right was the same as being wise. At 3 a.m, he rose and dressed and went back to the forge. The old man was awake, sitting by the banked fire, and he gestured for Ezra to sit with him. They sat in silence for a long time, and the silence was not empty. It was full of something, acceptance, maybe, or understanding, or the particular peace that comes when two people who do not speak each other's language have still managed to communicate something true. At dawn, the old man stood and walked to the door and began to step out, and Ezra let him go because he had to, because the alternative was to become the kind of man who would choose his own safety over another person's freedom. But the old man did not disappear. Instead, he walked the 10 acres slowly, leaning on his staff, and he stopped at 3 different places. Once where an underground outcropping of rock showed itself at the surface. Once where a small cluster of cottonwood trees grew from what seemed like bare earth, and once at a low point in the back corner, where water had once pooled and left mineral marks. He was looking for something, searching for it, and when the sun had risen fully and Ezra could see clearly, the old man came back inside and went to where Ezra kept a hide, a piece of elk skin that the younger Apache man, the one who came to Stillwater sometimes before the trouble, had left in trade. The medicine man took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to draw on it. His pictures were simple but deliberate: a line of water, a drop shape, a hand collecting from the earth. When he was done, he handed the hide to Ezra and pointed to each place he had marked on his map. And then he pointed out the door, toward the neighboring properties, toward the town. He was showing Ezra where water was, hidden water, the kind that still ran even in droughts, that came from deep in the earth, that could save a town. That afternoon, the sheriff and 2 other men came to take the Apache man and bring him to the edge of the territory. They arrived with horses and a kind of terrible politeness. They did not draw guns, but the guns were visible. Ezra did not resist. He knew that resistance would only make the consequences worse for the old man. Instead, Ezra brought the elder out into the light, and the old man stood tall, despite the fever and the broken arm and the weeks of recovery. The sheriff tried not to meet his eyes. One of the deputies looked away entirely. The elder looked at Ezra for a long moment, and then he nodded. Not goodbye, but acknowledgement. Then they put him on a horse, and they rode out of town, toward the north, toward the high country where the tribe would be waiting. But they did not ride far enough. On the 3rd night after the old man had been taken from the town, Ezra sat in his forge with a single lantern for light and examined what his choice had cost him. The ledger was simple to read. 8 weeks of full work had become nothing. 6 people who had promised him projects when the drought ended had found other hands. Goss had made good on his threat to bring in a blacksmith from Missoula, and that young man was hungry and cheap, taking work at rates Ezra could not afford to match. The well on Ezra's property had never run deep, and he was now carrying water from the town well in buckets, humiliating work that made the townspeople look away when he passed. He had perhaps 2 months of savings left. After that, the forge would close. He would have to leave Stillwater or sit in an empty shop and watch the world move on without him. Somewhere in those hours of dark calculation, Ezra heard something that was not the wind. A hoofbeat, distant and careful. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of many horses moving in the darkness, moving slowly, approaching the ridge that overlooked his property from the north. He went to the door and looked out, but the night was too complete to see anything. Yet, he knew, the tribe had been watching. They had always been watching. The old man's people had not abandoned him to the town's decision. They had tracked him, measured the distance, understood the cost. Ezra did not know this with certainty until the 4th day at first light when the riders came. They came from the east, a long line of them, maybe 30 horses, maybe more, and they moved without hurrying. They came down the ridge at a walk, and then across the open ground at a walk, and they stopped at the edge of town, at the point where Stillwater's jurisdiction ended and the territory beyond began. They did not ride into town. They did not shout. They simply waited, a silent line of Apache riders with the sun rising behind them, and every person in Stillwater who had seen the old man taken away understood immediately that something had shifted, that this moment was the hinge on which everything turned. The riders sat their horses with impatience that was itself a kind of power. They were not rushed. They were not furious. They were simply present, and their presence was enough to change the quality of the air itself. The riders were led by a chief. He did not wear a feathered headdress, but his bearing made authority unnecessary. His face was weathered and intelligent. He sat his horse with the weight of someone who had made decisions that cost him everything and had never regretted them. Beside him was the medicine man, and the medicine man was smiling. Behind him were warriors, and behind them were others, women, children, families, but they stayed well back. Only the chief and a translator and the old medicine man came forward. Ezra walked out to meet them. He did not ask permission. He simply walked out into the open space between the town and the riders, and the chief dismounted and walked toward him, and they met in the dust like two men with something to settle that had nothing to do with violence. The chief was perhaps 6 inches shorter than Ezra, but he seemed to occupy more space. His face was lined with years of sun and decision. His eyes were clear and patient. He wore traditional Apache clothing, and around his neck hung a turquoise pendant identical to the medicine man's. He looked at Ezra for a long moment, then nodded slightly. The old medicine man spoke first in Spanish, and a younger translator repeated his words. He says you gave him water when your people would have let him die. He says you set his arm with hands that knew kindness. He says you stood against your own people for one act of compassion. This is not a small thing. This is what decides a man's spirit. This is a thing we honor. The chief then spoke in broken English, each word measured. We have watched your land. We have seen the water beneath your earth, water that will not die when the sky withholds rain. The medicine man showed you where it runs. We bring knowledge to your people because you kept what was sacred in you. A man who will stand alone against his own people. This is a man we stand beside. The water will save your town. The medicine we bring will heal the sickness that comes in the dry seasons. These are gifts, not payment. Payment for kindness is insulting. These are exchanges between peoples who understand that one life, one old man, one stranger your town would have cast away. This value is more than gold. This is the difference between civilization and what animals have. The riders moved, but not in the way anyone had imagined. They brought forward horses laden with bundles, dried meat in hide, herbs smelling of sage and cedar, medicines in clay vessels. They laid them carefully in a line. The medicine man came forward and held a piece of hide marked with the map, now elaborated with deeper markings. He gave it to Ezra, their hands touching for a moment. The chief's hand gripped Ezra's shoulder, and he turned and walked back to his horse. The medicine man followed. The riders formed back into their line and walked the way they had come, back across the open ground, back up the ridge, and disappeared into the high country. In their going, something shifted in Stillwater, a shift so profound that no one could have said exactly when it happened, but they all felt it. A change in the air itself, a repositioning of what was possible and what was understood about courage. The first people to understand what had happened came to the forge by afternoon. They came quietly without asking permission, and they looked at Ezra with different eyes. Goss came. The sheriff came. The woman whose sister had been killed came, and she stood in the doorway and did not speak, but her eyes held something different than before. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but something closer to understanding. By evening, someone had begun to dig where the hide indicated. Within 2 days, water began to flow. It rose from underground like an answer to a prayer, cold and clean and endless, and the town of Stillwater discovered that what it had viewed as loss, the elder, the compassion, the choice to stand alone, had been the beginning of salvation. The medicine the Apache had brought came from plants that grew in the high desert. and they proved effective against a sickness that had begun to spread through the children of the settlement. 3 children might have died. Instead, by the application of the herbs and the knowledge the tribe had sent, all 3 recovered. The story of what Ezra had done, what had seemed like betrayal, became instead a story of vision, of the kind of courage that stands against the crowd and is later vindicated. The forge never again went as quiet as it had gone during those weeks of boycott, but Ezra also never again allowed it to become the center of everything. He kept the work, but he did not let the work keep him. Once a year, on the first day of October, riders would appear on the ridge to the north, and they would leave something at the edge of the property, sometimes fresh meat, sometimes a hide, sometimes a carved wooden object that took him weeks to understand. Ezra would walk out to collect these gifts, and he would leave his own offerings in return, horseshoes he had made with his best skill, tools, sometimes a bolt of cloth that came from the east, things that had value. The townsfolk of Stillwater learned not to question this exchange. It became, over time, simply part of the rhythm of the place, as regular as the seasons, as necessary as the water the tribe's knowledge had revealed. Years later, when Ezra was an old man himself, he would sit in the forge and think about what it meant to be needed, and then to stop being tolerated, and then to be understood as something you had not known you were being perceived as. A man of honor, a man of principle, a man who had paid a price for being right and had been rewarded not for the payment, but for the willingness to make it. The forge still burned. The metal still rang. The town still came, though it was a different town now, with new people and new needs, and the story of the man who had defended an Apache elder was the kind of story people told to their children to explain what it meant to choose compassion when the cost was everything. The old medicine man died in his own mountains, but his memory lived on in the water that still flowed from Ezra's land, and in the knowledge that a single act of kindness, made without expectation of return, could ripple outward and change the shape of a territory. The difference between an enemy and a neighbor, Ezra came to understand, was usually just the choice of which one you decided to be when it mattered most. And it always mattered most. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts in Honor, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.